So again, so we'll start with a quick overview, just an introduction to Sightline and the architecture and an overview of the interface itself, and then start looking at visualization, because of course visualization is, my entire screen, is the one, okay, somebody just joined. Because visualization is really what you see most of all, right? So we're going to get EDM entirely configured, and then after that, it just does what it's supposed to do, right? It's working in the background. So we'll start. I'm trying to get this on the other screen. I might have to. I'm going to have to share my other screen, sorry. Okay. Okay, so you should see a presentation. This says Sightline EDM. So this is what we're going to talk about. Like I said,
and we also see the preview slide. The next slide, we're seeing the preview section of it.
So it's sharing the wrong screen. This is really weird. Okay, we're just not going to mess with that then. We'll do the preview slide. So what we're going to look at is the configuration, and then we'll look at the agenda that I mentioned. So look at, what are the data sources? How do we connect the data sources? But most of our time is going to be spent on the user interface, and then tomorrow we'll talk about the analysis features. And EDM has a lot of analysis features, things you can do, not just looking at data, but what does the data tell you? What can we do with the data? We'll talk a little bit about the power agents and troubleshooting EDM and the data that we're receiving, the connections. So the first thing I wanted to look at is the components. So what are the components and the architecture, right? Because as I just mentioned, Sightline is doing a lot of different things, right? The whole Sightline suite, in some implementations, it's just EDM. EDM is doing the data collection, and it's also doing the alerting as we receive data from our data sources, no matter what they are. We can alert on that data as we receive it. We can analyze the data. We summarize the data for long-term storage and display, and then we also can report on it. And we have a lot of different reporting options that we could use. So let's talk a little bit about these data sources. So we can get data sources from a number of different monitored objects, we'll call them. First of all, historically, this was our first data source, is from an IT system. Any operating system, such as Linux or Windows or some mainframe operating systems, we install a process on those operating system instances called the power agent, and the power agent collects data, any data that's available, generally CPU utilization, memory, disk activity, etc. And why is that important? Well, if your system is having problems, then your workload or your transactions are not going to be processed, or at least not in a timely manner. They might not be processed at all. But we also have data sources from other areas. For instance, OPC in manufacturing or MQTT is an option to get data from PLCs. we can get data from SNMP devices. So items in your network, like switches and routers, if they have an IP address and SNMP is enabled, we can get data from them. A very popular option that we have in a lot of places is a CSV file, comma-separated values. And what that means is some mechanism is in place that sends data to EDM on a regular basis, whether it's every minute or every 5 minutes or even every 2 seconds. And EDM reads the data from those files and stores it. Once EDM has stored the data, he can do any of the display and analysis that we're going to look at over the next couple of days. Okay, and that's the last point. It doesn't matter how you get the data into EDM. Once EDM has it, we can visualize it. We can do any kind of reporting, ad hoc reporting, scheduled reporting, and then analysis. So I want to look a little bit at EDM itself, and then we're going to look at the user interface. So EDM has a couple of different processes that work together. The data collector service is a Java-based process, and it does the actual data handling. So it receives the data, and it stores the data in the data repository. So there is a database where all of the data is stored. It's always time series data, although we can add some additional context data to the database as well. But what we receive from our data sources is time series, which means it always has to have a timestamp. And then we use that for analysis and visualization. There is a second database called the admin database, and our default is PostgreSQL, but that's where the configuration information is stored. So when we start looking at connections, charts, reports, all of those settings are stored in the admin database. So there are now 2 of them. One is for the performance data itself. The other one is for the configuration settings. And then finally, EDM is a browser-based interface to get to the data. And we support multiple browsers. Internet Explorer, of course, Edge, Firefox, Chrome. So pretty much whichever browser you're using is we're going to support it. And that means that we test with it to make sure that they all work properly. Okay, so this is just a different picture of what I was just talking about. So EDM is the user interface, and that's where we do all of our analysis and reporting. That's where our alerts are displayed. The data collectors, DCS instances, they're the ones that actually collect the data and store it locally. And then we have all sorts of data sources.
Debbie,
yeah.
Are you showing a different slide from the course agenda?
Well, I thought Zach told me that you were seeing that. That's what you were seeing.
We are seeing only the course agenda.
We're seeing only the agenda. If you've moved on and switched slides,
yes,
you haven't seen any of them.
So let me move over here. It wasn't moving, so I kind of assumed that you were still seeing the other thing. I'm really sorry. You should have stopped me earlier. So let me go back.
All the subjects were on that you were talking about were on this overview thing. So I assumed it was.
Sorry, I misunderstood what you said. I thought I was showing the other screen, so I was just talking.
So right now we are in the screen, slide 5.
So now you see the picture.
Now we see the picture. Yeah, slide 5.
Okay. Gosh, I wish you had interrupted me sooner, but sorry.
No problem.
So I am displaying the screen that I thought I was displaying. I just was discombobulated.
Wait, no,
Okay.
because we're still seeing the presentation. We're still seeing the like side where it says show taskbar, display settings, and slideshow. With the one with the notes on the side, I'm seeing that.
You shouldn't be seeing that.
You need to do display settings and duplicate settings, because we are watching two slides.
Yes, that's as he said.
So go to display settings, and then
In my
top left in display settings, and you need to select duplicate.
Okay, I'm not seeing that.
Because you have two screens, right?
Yes.
So in one screen you need to see the options there in the PowerPoint.
Okay, so what do you see now?
The
Actually,
website, Sightline website,
Yep, we now see
the browser.
And that's the screen that I thought I was sharing.
No.
Okay, so now you see my
That is the PowerPoint right now.
All right, then that's what I thought I was displaying.
It was showing the display. It was showing the other view, the one with the two slides on the other side. But now we're seeing the correct version of what we should be seeing.
Perfect. Sorry. Well, gosh, I'll know better than to try that next time. Well, let me back up a little bit then. So this is what I was talking about when I said EDM is doing all of these different things, right? So the data collector is collecting the data, and that's the DCS piece. And then EDM, the browser piece, there's a lot going on in there because most of it is visualization or some type of analysis. And that's taken care of from the EDM interface. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the components of Sightline. And what that does is gives us the option of getting data from a lot of different sources. You remember I was talking about OPC. CSV files are extremely popular as an option. And the reason for that is that they're easy to configure. But with manufacturing, like if you have PLCs, we can use OPC. There are some other options like MQTT that we support. In those instances, like OPC or SNMP, there is a lot of available information from that data source, and you may not want to get all of it. So what we do is we create a mapping file, and that mapping file says, okay, there are 500 pieces of information available. I only want maybe 10 or 100, and we identify which ones they are. So when EDM gets the information, he only pulls out those specific values and then stores them. And the others are discarded. Sometimes there are empty data pieces anyway. So, and then the EDM interface uses all of the different browsers that I mentioned. Edge, Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Chrome. Although I will say we're going to stop testing with Internet Explorer in our next release. So we talked about the components of the Sightline solution and the fact that there are 4 different pieces. In general, they will all run, even though we look at them separately, they will all be installed on the same server. So what does that look like? We'll come back to that. What that looks like is what you see here, Sightline EDM on the right-hand side. We have EDM, which is the browser. Now, EDM is based on Wildfly, so that process is always running in the background to respond when you open and connect with your browser. The data collector service, remember I mentioned, is a Java-based application. And then we have our performance data repository and our admin database. So 2 databases, both with very specific purposes, but they they don't share because they store different types of data and information. EDM can be installed on either a Windows system or a Linux system. And the size and configuration of that system itself really just depends on what it is that you're monitoring, how much data you plan to store, and how many data sources you have. I mentioned before that we have operating system monitors, the Power Agent, but also we have so many different other data sources. And DCS contacts them. It's just, he goes out and says, give me the data that you have. Again, every second, every 30 seconds, minute, 5 minutes, it doesn't matter as long as that's a consistent interval. So we can get data from a lot of different places, right? OnVIF is actually a camera. VMware gives us information about all of the guests that are running. JMX, which is really Java, right? So we can get information about what's going on within your Java application. And then we can get data from log files, the CSV files that we talked about, and we do have an API. So a lot of different options for getting data into EDM. Okay. So what does EDM do, right? What can it do for you? We can do capacity planning. We can do analytics. We can do reporting, forecasting. We have customers that do their weekly and monthly reports based on the data that we have collected and stored. So we do all of that within one application. So there's a lot of, there's a long presentation here, but I'm just going to go and look at EDM itself, because that way we'll be able to see, bring this over here. We'll be able to see it, right? It's easier to visualize it when we're talking about it. So questions so far. You should see the EDM homepage. Okay, again, stop me at any time because I'll just keep talking. I'll try and stop at about 10:25 or so. We'll have a quick break so everybody can get up and stretch and get a drink. So before we go any further, I mentioned that EDM has the 4 pieces. I did want to touch on that very briefly, that we have our installation option to just install all 4 of those pieces at the same time on the server. And we call that the one-click installer. But we do have instances where people want to separate the pieces, right? They want to put the database on a different storage location or something like that. And we can support that, okay? But the easiest is just to install everything all on the same system, both of the databases, EDM, and the data collector service. So how do we start and get into EDM? We have an instance here called NMIS. And really, all you need is the address of the server, nmis.sightline.com. Port 8080 is our default, although we can configure HTTP for secure communications. And then /EDM. So /EDM, that's all you need. And as a matter of fact, we'll log out and log back in. When we come in, you'll see the login page. When we first install EDM, it's going to be admin is the user ID. And we actually have changed that here, but then you can change and create as many user IDs as you need in your environment. So this is the home page, which is going to be the one that by default you log into. The home page is really informational, that's a word. And what I mean by that is it gives you an overview of what's going on in the environment. You can configure a report to be displayed. There's not one here. The second setting right here, system status, really just tells you that all of the pieces are active and everything is communicating together, right? So we have a data collector service. We know EDM is running because we're looking at it, and it tells us right here how many connections we have. On the left-hand side, we have that same information. This tells us, the green icon tells us that we have 13 active data sources. Data sources and connections are kind of interchangeable, so I'll use both of those terms. We have 5 connections that are configured but are not active, and sometimes we do that on purpose. Sometimes it's because the connection dropped for some reason. And then this little 1 tells us that there is 1 active alert, and that's what we see on the bottom part of the page. This is a summary of all of the alerts that have happened in the environment, all of the alerts on the monitored objects or the data sources. Now you can see on the left-hand side, most of them have green check marks. What that means is there was an alert, but it cleared. So in this case here, we at the very bottom, our Linux system had a high number of page outs, which is one of the metrics that we're being provided with. But the alert was active from 12:06, and then at 12:07, the next data block came in, and the value was back in an acceptable range. So the alert is cleared. It's no longer out of bounds. We get different types of alerts. For instance, if we can't collect data from a particular data source, we'll get an alert saying that our connection has dropped. In the case that the data collector, right, so we were actually doing some maintenance, and you can see the date, January 31st. The data collector, we restarted it, so it became unavailable, and then we started it back up again. So you can see it's not just data source oriented, it's also the environment itself. If we can't get to the data source, or if some value being provided by the data source is out of range. So we'll talk about alerting tomorrow and how to set up those alerts. But you can see this alert right here at the very top is still active. We said there's a Linux system. One of the values that's provided is the file system % used. So how much of the file system is being used? And we set an alert, and it's been violated, right? The incoming value exceeds the alert. And we can click on this link, and EDM will give us a visualization so that we can see what's happening. Okay, so you can see that it's shaded because it matches the red alert status. If we were to look at one of the older alerts, it would actually give us a slightly different screen. You can see here's at the very top is our threshold value at 30,000. And right now, everything is fine. So we don't see anything shaded because everything has gone back down to an acceptable level. So it's very easy to go in, log into EDM, and there you can see the picture of what your environment looks like. So over the next couple of days, we'll talk about how to configure all of this and make sure that everything is up and running. Okay, questions so far?
Yeah, I have a question. This is a cloud solution, or it can be deployed on premise?
Either one. It can be deployed in the cloud, or it can be deployed on-prem. And it can be deployed on a VM. Actually, most of our instances are deployed on VMware guests, or it can be deployed, like on just your laptop, actually.
Okay.
So you have a lot of different options.
Perfect. And what is the database that you use?
Which one? So we have two databases.
Uh-huh.
We have for the admin database, we use PostgreSQL. We do support Microsoft SQL Server and MySQL, but our default, when you do the one-click installation, uses Postgres.
Okay.
And the database for storing the actual data, we call Sightline DB, that's based on Influx, which is a time series database.
Can
It's
you repeat that last part for the Sightline database you use?
We call it Sightline DB or SDB, but it is based on Influx. And the reason we selected Influx is because it is designed for fast access and storing time series data in a smaller, the most compact way. Because we can store, we have customers that have data that goes back years. And so we want to make sure that you're not going to run out of space just because you stored so much data.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I want to look at a couple of settings before we get into the host and connections. And that would be the system settings. Now, up in the right-hand corner, you can see that we have a settings menu. And I'm logged in here as the EDM admin. The EDM admin has control over the entire system. There are configuration files that we would have to actually log into the system to edit, but we can edit a lot of the settings from here. And this, in general, is the display settings. What I mean by that is, what are we collecting, but how are we presenting it? How much data are we storing? The system settings at the bottom is a lot of information, but it has to do with what we're storing. EDM does run on an access key, and you can see our access key is good through next January. What will happen is on January 31st, EDM will simply stop working. So it's very easy to update the access key. You can do it right from here. And that's one of the ways that we limit where EDM is installed, right, for our customers and users. But a lot of these other settings have to do with, for instance, alerts. How old do we want to keep those? How long do we want to keep the alerts, right? Because alerts get old. Do we really need to know how many alerts there were, 3 weeks ago? We are working on an interface that will summarize the alerts for you, but that's in the next release of the product. Alerts can generate emails, and so we want to specify what is the email address or the EDM address that's going to be included. We have some settings about charts, about how many metrics you can include in a chart, things like that. We have information about email settings. This one's important because if you want EDM to send an email, you have to give it an email an email server to connect to send the email. So the default setting just says, SNMP test, but you would provide here the email server that you're using. EDM can send emails for several different purposes. And then the other ones that are things like the language. What is the default language that the display is going to use? And we do support multiple languages, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Japanese. We have a partner in Japan. And we were working on an aqua display. I don't know that that's going to be supported going forward. Okay. And then again, login settings, right? If your users come in and they type in the wrong password too many times, Do we want to limit that? The same with passwords. So these are the types of things that we can set in the system settings. But notice there are a lot of other things here. And one of them is schedules, right? We can schedule a lot of different things within EDM. We can schedule reports to be generated and saved in a PDF format on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. So we need to be able to create those schedules. And so there are some samples here that are already created. And then the other one that is really going to become important for us is the time definitions. When you display a report, what is the time range that you want to look at? A lot of times it's going to be show me the last hour or show me the last 24 hours so that I can see what was happening in the environment. But we can create time definitions that cover custom time ranges. Or we can say relative, show me the last full week or the last full month. So we're in February. The last full month is January, from January 1st to January 31st. So when I use a time definition like that, and I've said, add a time definition, I can even say the last 3 months. And so that would be the time in days might be the last 90 days, right? Or we have what I call relative. I can say last 3 months. So I would say monthly, starting with the previous month, which is January, and say include, I know it says days here, but include 3 months. Or 2 months or 3 months or whatever. And so then what will happen is EDM will start with today and figure out what the relative reference means, right? So last month, last 3 months, last, whatever it is that I've asked for. So a lot of these time definitions were actually added by users. And one of them is going to be the default, the little star over on the right-hand side. You can see this is the default time definition. Doesn't mean we can't change it, but we've said if I create a report, I've got to add a time definition. I'm going to default to last hour. And we're going to see that in just a second. So as we go through EDM, we'll look at a couple of different settings, but those are the ones that you'll see most often. Okay, questions again. All right, a quick overview of hosts and connections, how you tell EDM to get data, and then we'll start looking at visualization. So we have two of the tabs here. We have hosts and we have connections. And these two are used for configuration purposes, and then you really don't look at them too much after that. A host is an object that we want to monitor. So in general, that's going to be where the IP address is, if it's a server or a router or something like that. Or it just tells us what is the monitored object. Now, here you can see at the bottom we have NMIS. That's actually the name of this server where EDM is running. Some of these others are placeholders, but they are data sources where we're receiving CSV files. So we have to tell EDM what's the name of the data source itself. And then the connection is where, what data am I collecting more specifically, but also how much data am I going to store? And let's look at this one. This is, like I said, NMIS is a Linux system. I'm going to look at two. One is an operating system, which would be the IT world. Then we're going to look at one that's a file connection. And then if we have questions about OPC, we can talk about that as well. So the connection, under the host, we have details. I guess I should go back there. And that's going to be the display name, and then either the DNS name or the IP address. Now, if I'm getting data from a file connection, it may not have an IP address, but I do need to give it a name. So I just put the same name in both places. If I'm connecting to an IP address to a power agent that's running on an operating system or a server, then I need to connect to it on a specific port, and the default port is 1645. Now, the connections are, what data am I getting? And now, as I mentioned, NMIS is actually a Linux system. So we have one connection that is getting information about the Linux system itself. So that would be information like the CPU utilization, IOs. How many IOs am I doing per second? How much of the file system is in use, right? Because if you have a Linux system or a Windows system and you use up all of the storage, a Linux system will crash, right? I know that for a fact because I've seen it happen. But if you run out of space, right, that's not good. So what we do is we monitor every piece of information we can get. Again, about the CPU, the memory, the disk, the IOs, the network. What the connection details tell us are, first of all, how do I get to the data, right? So I'm either going to have an IP address or something. I'm going to give the data source a name. So this is the Linux information about the operating system. And do I want to evaluate any alerts? So we have a default. We do say there's a handful of Linux alerts that we want to monitor. And we'll look at how to configure those tomorrow. But we have a default connection setting. And whether it's Unix or Windows, EDM picks the alerts that apply and ignores the ones that don't, right? So even though I've got some Windows alerts mentioned here, EDM knows that they don't apply to this system. The important part here is the data repository and the history. So what this tells EDM and the data collector service is, how much data do you want me to store? So we're collecting data. We get a data block every 30 seconds from this data source. And we're going to store that data for 14 days. And that's what we have configured. The name of this repository is a combination of the host and the connection. And the reason we do that is because you can have multiple connections of the same type. For instance, we can have multiple Linux systems that we're monitoring. In a manufacturing environment, we can have multiple packing lines or pieces of information, and we're getting them from 3 or 4 different OPC servers. So we have to give it a unique name, and that's how we do it. So EDM and DCS work together to receive this data and store it. And when I say I want to visualize the data, we know how to tell EDM and DCS to retrieve that data and show it to us. Now, this is what we call the live data. We also summarize the data and store it for long-term use. And so by default, again, we have a 10-minute summary and a 30-minute summary. And over on the right-hand side, the edit icon is the same on most of our screens. We're going to save this 10-minute data for 4 months. And then we're going to save the 30-minute data for 25 months. That's for a couple of reasons. If I want to display a report from last year, I'm not going to be able to use the live data at 30 seconds, right? Because EDM would have to read an entire year of data and then summarize it to display it in one chart. Instead, if we start with data that's already summarized at 30 minutes, that's 48 data blocks in a day. It's a lot easier to summarize that data and then display it for monthly or quarterly or even annual reports. Now you can see I have two more connections. One is DCS and one is EDM. And the connection type over on the right-hand side, you can see it says it's a JMX connection. So we talked about that a little bit before, but basically EDM and DCS are Java-based processes. So we're getting data from the Java process about what he's doing internally, right? Java basically grabs his memory and uses it the way he wants to, but we don't know what's going on inside the Java process unless we monitor it specifically, right? So we can look at different data sources and get different type of information. The same thing is going to happen. We have some alerts. You can see we don't have an alert group here because we didn't create one. We're going to store this data for 14 days, and we are going to do the same type of summarization. Now, there's also a triggered alerts tab for each connection. The main page that we looked at had the summary of all of the alerts in the environment. For individual connections, we only get the alerts that apply to that data source. And then the logs that we have right here, this is the connection log. So when I connected to whatever my data source is, I wrote a log file, and this is the log file to get to the DCS process on NMIS. I have log files for every other connection in the environment. Okay, and that is how every single connection is going to look. If you have a file connection, let's go back to the host page. I have a lot of different connections here, but one, if you looked at the packing line demo that I sent the link to, we're going to look at some of those same reports. That data is based on file connections. And so you can see we have a connection that's coming from each of our each of the components in the packing line demo. There's a case erector, there are palletizers, shrink wrappers, strappers. And so each one is its own connection. And we have a different type of settings because this is a CSV file connection. So what it's saying is the process interval, every 20 seconds, we're going to go out and there is a specific location named for this connection. And we're going to check that directory on the EDM server to see if there's a new CSV file. And if there is, we're going to read it, process that data, and put it into the Sightline database. And then EDM can reference it using the name of this packline palette data source, and we can retrieve that data and display it and analyze it. And you can see in this case, we even changed the retention policy. We're going to keep that data for 4 months. And this is the live data that we're collecting every 20 seconds, or that we try and retrieve every 20 seconds if it's there. Okay, so we've got quite a bit of flexibility with how we're retrieving the data and how we're storing the data. Okay, questions so far? Okay, I want to talk about visualization, but let's take a, 5-minute break if anybody needs to get up, get a drink, and we'll come back. I'm just going to leave this display right where it is, so we'll be fine.
Okay, David, thank you.
Thanks, Deb.